Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, for wherever participants are calling in from. Welcome to the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution webinar about the Open-Ended Working Group 1.2 on the Science Policy Panel for Chemicals, Waste, and Pollution Prevention. That's starting next week. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please keep your microphones on mute throughout the presentation. We will do a series of question and answers after the presentations. At that point, you are definitely welcome to unmute and ask your questions. So we will definitely return to there. But meanwhile, please feel free to use the question and answer section to post any questions that you might have. Okay, so to get us started, we just want to reflect a quick bit on the fact that it's been about 1 year since the United Nations Environment Assembly approved the resolution to explore establishing the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste, and Pollution Prevention. At the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution, we've been working very hard with our partners and others to get that resolution passed. Because of course we are in the business of preventing pollution and addressing pollution and its impacts on human health. At GAHP, we are very interested in ensuring the success of this panel and to bring to bear the latest scientific knowledge on pollution, chemicals, and health issues, because the best scientific knowledge really helps us ensure that our public policy is informed by science and is in the best decision making that we can make based on what's available to date. And credible and respected platforms for this purpose not only ensure that we have good policy making, but they help expand in the mind of the public these types of issues that our organization is concerned with, and many of you are as well. And it helps governments, civil society, academia, and others to be able to respond to this crisis of pollution and health and chemicals and waste issues that we see at the forefront today. In fact, chemicals, waste, and pollution are now one of the 3 environmental pillars that UN Environment Program has identified as crises that we have to address as a planet. It's our hope that the Science Policy Panel for Chemicals, Waste, and Pollution Prevention will ensure that there's a best application of science to policymaking and solutions, and that it will ensure that there's focused attention of governments and all of these others, sectors, private sector, academia, civil society, et cetera, on this issue. We're here today because the Open-Ended Working Group, the second 1.2, starts next week in Bangkok in Thailand. And we wanted to take the opportunity today to talk about what's on the table for negotiation, kind of what's at stake, what are people going to be talking about. We wanted to share with you what GAHP's position is, what our key messages are, and why we will be advocating for them. And last but not least, we would like to hear from you, what you or your organization or government, if you're able to share with us, what you will be advocating for at that meeting. I would like to now turn over to my colleague, Jill Hanna, who is a senior advisor at the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution. She's been with us a long time. Many of you know her from her previous roles at the European Commission, where she was negotiating many of the environmental treaties on behalf of the European Commission. She also previously worked for the UK government for UK aid, formerly known as DFID. Jill, I am happy to have you take the floor to talk about what's on the table in Bangkok next week.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Good afternoon from where I am, since I'm sitting in a snowstorm in France. I hope somebody can make my screen show, make my video show, and I hope you can hear me, because I can't make myself appear, apparently. Anyway.
So Jill, just 1 second. I think they've given you host privileges, so you should be able to share your video now.
Okay, right. Excuse the slightly odd background that this is a ski chalet where I am, and there's not many places where you can set up an office. Anyway, I'm very much looking forward to seeing a lot of you in Bangkok next week. The meeting will be the first real meeting of the OEWG, the Open-Ended Working Group, which is supposed to finish off the work that we didn't really do in Nairobi when we set out the broad outlines of what we would like a science policy panel to do in relation to chemicals, wastes and pollution. So we had a meeting in Nairobi, a one-day virtual, well, a hybrid meeting in the fall, and that did not get as far as it should because the Russian invasion of Ukraine got in the way. So both Russia and Ukraine wanted to be on the bureau of the Open-Ended Working Group. They blocked each other, and the Russians also blocked the EU candidate for being the chair as one of the two Western European and others group members on the bureau. She wasn't allowed to be elected to the bureau, and so there are, in fact, I think still 3 vacancies to be filled. That unfortunately took up most of the day during the meeting in Nairobi. I hope that a lot of behind the scenes efforts have been going on. I'm not sure what the outcome will be, but this is an in-person meeting only in Bangkok. You can watch it from afar, but you can't actually take part in the sense of being a negotiator. So maybe who gets to Bangkok will help to determine how this goes. So I hope we will not spend more than half a morning on procedural matters, but who knows. Then the 2 big elements that we are going to be looking at this meeting are scope of the science policy panel and its functions. And I thought, agreed with Rachel, that probably it was best to spend this time looking at the scope, because until you've looked at the scope, you're not really very sure about the functions. And also, many different groups will have particular functions that they want done, and there's not really a reason why the list shouldn't be fairly large, although it may then take many, many years for the panel to get to all the kinds of things that people want it to do. However, I think if we don't manage to deal with the scope at this meeting, we will be very much behind schedule, because we're only, I think, supposed to have 2 more meetings. And one of the problems is that, in fact, donors have not pledged enough money to fund the meeting schedule that has been suggested. So there will also be discussions about resources, which as an NGO, resources for running the process. As an NGO, GAHP will not have views on that. So fine, I'd like now, if I may, to talk very much about scope. I hope everybody has managed to read document UNEP/SPP-OEWG1/4, which is the document on scope. All of these documents, or most of these documents anyway, including the INF documents, are dated sometime in November, but as they didn't appear on the website, as is usually the case, for several weeks after they were supposedly finished. So for many people, they will have appeared just as the Christmas break happened. And it may be that large groups have not had as much time to prepare as they would like. I have to say that that's also my case, but I hope I've done enough preparation to make this a useful meeting. And in any case, I'm relying on you all to have much better ideas. So the scope is what this document is about. It has a main body of a text, and then it has an annex. And I find this format rather unfortunate, frankly, because the annex discusses very many rather fundamental points on the approach. And it may be that people don't read the annex and don't really take it in when they are responding to the points made in the main document, because it's not actually very much referred to in the main document. So the beginnings of the discussion could get quite messy, I think. And I would urge you all to pay quite a lot of attention, if you haven't already managed to do so, to the annex. And I will explain why. The document itself has a bit of introduction, which is the background to the to why we have an open-ended working group. If anybody would like some more some elaboration of that, I can do it. Maybe you want to put your hand up now, and I'll pause and do it, if that's possible. I don't know, Rachel.
I'm not seeing any hands up, so I think
fine.
we can go back to that later if needed.
Yeah, if need be, I'll go back to that later. In any case, it's well set out in section 1 of the report, which is the introduction. Now, section 2, proposing an integrative approach to establishing the scope, is where, in the view of GAHP, some of the real issues and problems start to appear. They are in two forms, and I'm not actually following the order of the text in what I'm going to say next. The paragraph 5, the first paragraph of the integrative approach, very rightly says that you could, if you wanted to, turn this panel with its extraordinarily long name, a science policy panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution. You could give it 3 different scopes, one on chemicals, one on waste, and one on pollution. And effectively, it would work as 3 panels. With all the problems that would make about meeting time and who needed to be there when and all the rest of it. Those of us who survived the bringing together of the chemicals of the Rotterdam, Stockholm and Basel Convention will know that taking a separated approach is probably not a good idea. And indeed, there are people who would have preferred Minamata to be part of that mix. So GAHP very much welcomes the idea that we have an integrated approach where you look at chemicals and wastes, which are part of a life cycle, and you look at pollution, which may be part of that life cycle, but can be from completely different elements, caused by very different things. Iran, for example, might say that sandstorms are a form of pollution because they wreck the agricultural fields of Iran, but they have nothing to do with chemicals or wastes. So the integrative approach that is set out in this section is one that starts from the idea that what we are focused on is the life cycle of chemicals And if they're not soundly managed, the resultant badly managed wastes, and then pollution. And you will find this set of ideas spelt out in paragraph, let me just find it, paragraph paragraph 9, which says that an integrative scoping could facilitate a global value chain approach, and that the concept considers a chemical supply chain as a starting point. The resulting product's life cycle then extends to the end of life phase of the value chain as it is used or consumed, after which the product enters a waste handling stream, or if not well managed, may contribute to pollution issues. So that is the approach, that the central plank of this panel is chemicals, and the rest flows from chemicals. And the value chains, in other words, the production and consumption processes, start with a chemical. They may go into a textile value chain, they may go into a manufacturing chain of a different sort, but it starts from a chemical. Now, if you read the annex, it is made very clear that this is not the only integrative approach that you could use. Instead, the alternative is it describes the value chain approach as a chemicals up approach. So you start from the specific of chemicals and you go into wastes and you go into pollution. And the likelihood is, although this is not spelt out very much in the annex, that if the pollution comes from another source but a chemical manufacturing process and consumption process, you will not be interested in the pollution, which, for example, would make it rather difficult to be interested in a lot of air pollution, particularly, for example, indoor wood smoke, which is a major killer. So in the annex, it contrasts this idea of a chemicals up process with a pollution down process. And the pollution down process, instead of looking at value chains and where the economic benefits are, looks at health impacts. And I'm sure none of the audience will be surprised to hear that for GAHP, that is a more comfortable approach.
Okay, we've lost Jill. Let's pause the recording and let's get her back.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody for being so patient. The problem is that this option is not in the main paper. So it's going to, and since there is not, for example, a draft decision which would come out of the working group on scope, the Secretariat hasn't produced a zero draft, so presumably we're all expected to do so. There is no piece of text that one can fiddle with easily to say that we like an integrative approach, but not necessarily that one, the value chain one. So there's going to have to be some quite careful thinking about how we approach trying to make our points. And obviously, the more people who agree with us will have to make a very clear opening statement on this agenda item. And the more people who share our perspective, the better. Now, some of the arguments for suggesting that our approach has merit is that it seems that if you have a value chain approach, then I suspect that an awful lot of the poorer countries, the lower income countries in particular, who are not big players in international trade, for example, will feel that this process doesn't really have very much to do with them. I'm thinking particularly of African countries that may not be major producers of one part of the textile chain, for example. So it, I think, is not an approach that is particularly attractive to the poorest countries, but I would very much welcome views on that. It excludes very largely air pollution, I believe. I mean, yes, you can trace air pollution back to individual chemicals elements, but they're not things on the whole that people are trying to produce. They're unwanted byproducts. And it certainly wouldn't get you into indoor air pollution or traffic and PM 2.5 as pollution sources, which are major killers. It also seems to us that, so that's two arguments. One about, does it really help? Is it really attractive to the poorer countries? Two, does it capture all forms of pollution? Three, how is it duplicative of UNEP's International Resource Panel, which looks at natural resources and how they are used in supply chains and tries to move to sustainable consumption and production? And I think there would be an awful lot of overlap in the work, although the International Resources Panel is not the same kind of animal as this science policy panel is supposed to be, in that it doesn't have recommendations that are debated by all governments and approved in some kind of process. It's much less formal. But there is duplication. And using the value chain approach makes it a very economic approach. It's about costs and benefits economically. Whereas if you start from pollution down and look at health impacts, you are much more concentrating on the social benefits of a longer active life, for example. So I think there is a very good debate to be had on the two approaches. The only argument given in ANES not going down the pollution down approach, in other words, starting from health impacts, is that these can take a very long time to become obvious. And it's not obvious what the offending chemical or anything else is very often for even longer. And this is reasonably true. However, we already know about a whole lot of nasties that are that are causing an enormous amount of damage in developing countries. I would take lead, for example, where almost nothing is being done by international aid agencies to stop 1 million people a year dying prematurely from lead poisoning. Another one would be air pollution, as I've mentioned, that, for example, COVID meant that for the first time in 40 plus years, people in Delhi were able to see, because industry shut, were able to see that the Himalayas were actually there. And that must have created an awful lot of political momentum, which might be taken forward in such a panel, but won't be in a value chain approach. So these are reasons why I think it's not right to say, well, it takes a long time to emerge. I think the panel could start very well, spending its first 5 years on very basic health impacts. And I'd like to call this taking the alternative Nobel Prize approach. What we don't need is for this panel to concentrate on giving eminent chemists from Western Europe and other region, the industrialized world, a place to build their credibility towards a Nobel Prize. What we in GAHP would like it to do is to solve very practical issues at costs that are affordable and with policy options that are feasible in countries that don't have many resources. And we feel that that can be done. So for all those reasons, we would like to have quite a long discussion about what the integrative approach should be and whether the value chain part of it should come a bit later and the health impact part prove its worth on problems that everybody knows about to begin with. Another element that's brought up in this part of the text, I'm still on part 2 of the text, is it mentions in paragraph 8, I think. Yes, it mentions only Sustainable Development Goal Target 12.4, the sustainable management of chemicals and wastes, as being relevant to this panel. Now, from a GAHP perspective, that is a huge misunderstanding. For us, for example, GAHP was instrumental in getting target 3.9 on premature deaths and disease from pollution, chemicals and wastes into the SDGs. And to then go and ignore this seems to us a perverse approach. And there are plenty of other SDG targets that are relevant to this panel, as we can explain, but don't necessarily have time to do now. So we would like people to think outside the box of having come from a chemicals management background when they are taking part in the discussions next week. So we would like, and we, as I said, we want the alternative Nobel Prize sort of approach and ethic, so that scientists get excited about how could we do cheap but effective and reliable blood lead level monitoring at scale. How could we extend the global burden of disease analysis to many more hazardous materials than it currently covers? We also think that the panel could work very well on things like improving the SDG indicators in this area, because the SDG indicators were not a fully democratic process. They were put together by the UN Statistical Commission, which is made up of extraordinarily eminent statisticians, but who happen to be head of national statistical services and are therefore used to looking at economic, social, in terms of health and education type of data, and not at environmental data. And the indicators are weak on environmental data, and they're weak on health impacts. So that would be another job for the panel. Then I would like to move to perhaps the final part of this, this document that is of concern to us. We see there is, in section 3, there are a number of elements about how you would go about establishing the scope. We share the idea that looking at an objective is really important in this context, but we would note that the 3 preambles in the resolution 5.8 adopted in Nairobi a year ago which basically explain what the objective of the panel is, are all about health. They're preambles 6, 7, and 8. So we don't know why the word health doesn't appear in this objectives section. And we have a proposed rewrite of the objective, which would bring in this element. At the moment, the objective seems to be to do value chain analysis, and that sounds to us more like a function than an objective. There's also talk of a conceptual framework in part B of section 3, where the Secretariat is offering to prepare a conceptual framework, but we don't understand what this is for. And the Secretariat asks whether we want a closed or an open list approach to the scope, and suggests that an open list scope would be better, and GAHP would certainly agree with that. Then there are some questions about the elements that the institutions that GAHP should be, that the panel should be working with. And we would have some questions there, but I'm not sure we have time really to go into that. And as for the next steps, which is section 5 of the document, we think those make sense, but they'd have to be looked at in the context of the things I've been talking about. I'm sorry that was quite rushed, but I hope it's been helpful.
Thank you very much, Jill. It was extremely interesting, and I think, and hopefully also others felt the same way, that this was very, very helpful to kind of go through, step by step in this document and say, okay, here's what's there and what it really means and what we're talking about. So I'm really quite glad that we were able to have an understanding about the different types of approaches, and that it certainly does warrant debate, and we look forward to seeing how that debate goes. I would like now to turn to the Q&A. We do have a question there for you, Jill. Which is a question on your point about the pollution down approach. Could you comment how, in your view, one could adequately or provide timely responses to new and emerging chemicals and pollutants if the observed health pacts are the trigger for action in a pollution down approach? Or in other words, how can we prevent negative health impacts from new chemicals and pollutants from occurring in the first place?
I am not a chemist, so nobody should take too much notice of my answer here. But my answer here would be, for example, that the European Chemicals Agency is doing an enormous, and similar bodies in the States and elsewhere are doing enormous amounts of work. And I picked the European one particularly because it does not allow a new chemical on the market unless its manufacturers or its proposers can demonstrate that it is expected to be safe. You can never be 100% certain because you're proving a negative, but that's the process. Now, it seems to GAHP that given that we haven't even got enough money to get through the open-ended working group question, then we haven't got enough money to fund this part of the process. We do not expect, at least to start with, the panel to be very rich. And therefore, I would say in GAHP's view, we would want to piggyback on what is happening and being funded anyway by the European Agency, for example, and others. Of course, other countries are not going to have complete confidence in that, but we should be using our resources in this panel to solve practical problems that are killing people now and that we do know about.
Thanks very much, Jill. There's some other questions that have come up. One participant is asking, what about the interactions of chemicals? Any thoughts on that?
Well, again, it's a very good question, Jacques. I don't actually think that either a value chain or a health impact approach is particularly good at tackling that. I don't think that a value chain would be any better than trying to work out health impacts of multiple chemicals.
And if I might jump in, I know that there are several partners working on the Horizon 2020 research scanning program called Precision Toxicology, run out of University of Birmingham. And there's also a large number of other partners working on this to assist in exactly what Jill was talking about in terms of, enabling companies to be able to test their products and ensure that there's no negative health impacts before they get launched on the market. There is a decent amount of research going on in that type of area for tools and ways for that process to happen quicker. And they are also looking at the second question, what might that cumulative effects be? If you're exposed to multiple types of toxicants, what health impacts might then emerge out of that? And so I think we should stay tuned for those types of things and see what the research is saying. But certainly, to Jill's point, there is a scarcity of resources, and we, at GAHP are of course focused on trying to tackle the enormous health burden that we see already, while at the same time trying to keep our finger on what are the emerging issues of concern. Thank you. A last question is on how the emerging use of existing chemicals and or new chemicals would be addressed. I think it's quite similar.
For me, it's rather similar to the first question. If I'm misunderstanding that, perhaps Ramsar could rephrase it somehow, and we'll see if all the participants on board can give a better answer.
Ramsar, would you like to take the microphone? Ramsar, we're inviting you to clarify your question if you're allowed, if you're there. Sorry, if you're able to. Right. If you come back on in the next minute, Ramsar, we'll be happy to hear your question so you can clarify it. Meanwhile, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A that we haven't discussed. Would anyone like to voice a question verbally? Please raise your hand. All right, someone's raised their hand. Karthi, please, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
I don't have a question, Rach, but I just wanted to reinforce and supplement Jill's excellent analysis of the issues before the Bangkok meeting. The first is about priority. As she rightly said, we should go with the pollution down approach, largely because this enables us to integrate the health aspects of pollution, which is what GAHP is all about. But I think it's important here also to say that while looking at the health and pollution issues, we need to keep in mind priorities. Resources are limited, as Jill explained, and so it's important that we conserve those resources in attacking the principal problems that face humanity. And a question of priority is, if you go with the criterion of health to look at pollution issues, we should go one step further and look at the scale of those health impacts. So in deciding what the scope of the panel should be, let's start with the idea that we start looking at the principal health impact issues of pollution first. And that's my first point. The second point, which is related, is a question of ensuring balance in the coverage of the panel's work. And Jill alluded to this in the sense that in the climate change approach, for example, the interest of African countries might be quite limited. I think for a multilateral operation like a science policy panel, we need to ensure that all countries and all regions have the interest in the organization's work. So issues of interest, pollution and health issues of interest to low and middle income countries should be in the forefront of the work of the panel, in addition to what might be of concern to industrialized countries. And lastly, I think the two existing science policy panels, which are the Climate IPCC and IPBES, they pay some attention to the synergies between the work of those two panels. And I think it will be important in the scope of this one to also ensure synergies with the two existing science policy panels. So those are the three comments I would make to buttress what Jill was saying about the scope of the science policy panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karthi. I see Ramsa, you've raised your hand. Please, you may take the floor to clarify your question.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity. My question was like, we know that there are a number of use of mercury at the moment for different process, different product, and there will be a possibility of using mercury for the new type of its application. And in that case also there is a significant impact could happen associated with the new type of application of mercury or any chemicals. So that was my question. So today we know that like Minamata Convention came with a certain scope of the impact knowing from the existing, but there could be a possibility of new application of mercury in future that need to be addressed. So that was the perspective of my questions. And definitely like today we have 350 lakhs chemicals in use. Tomorrow maybe another number of new chemicals is coming. So I wonder like a scope of this science policy panel could have some formal venue for the prospective new chemicals, upcoming new chemicals. I don't know how much I can clarify the question, but
yeah, that helps. Thank you, Ramsa. This is Jill Hanna, and that helps me a lot. Thank you very much for the clarification. On new uses for mercury, I'm sorry, I'm not in my usual place of working, so I don't have all my copies of conventions to hand, and since I'm using the computer for this, I'm not looking up either. But my understanding is that the objective of the Minamata Convention is to phase out all uses of mercury. So having a new use of mercury would, and I understand that you're correct in saying that what's in the annex as to phase out times and all that is about existing uses, but I think it would be very hard for a party to the Minamata Convention to have legislation allowing new uses I know that we have
I just put the mercury as example. That
Yeah,
would
sure.
be.
And it's certainly the case that 90%, I mean, 99% of known chemicals are not covered by convention. So the POPs, mercury are the exceptions. And of course, ozone depleting substances through Vienna, they are very much the exceptions. The rest, there's the voluntary agreement of SICAM and whatever it replaces it from the end of this year. But so your concern is a very legitimate one. My point was simply that I do not think this panel will have the resources to be able to vet all new chemicals before they're put on the market, nor would it have the legitimacy to do so. This is not an internationally binding treaty that we are setting up here. It's not a convention. It's a scientific body there to provide advice to governments and NGOs and anybody else. So it's not this science policy panel that will be able to prevent anything going on the market, but it will be able to, in some cases, allow governments to make much more informed decisions. The point I was making earlier, and perhaps it wasn't very clear, is that there is, at least in Europe, an agency with the power to say no to putting something new on the market, which has to be satisfied that the new chemical is safe. Now, what their decision making is available. Not all of the evidence is available because some of it is commercially sensitive, but their conclusions are available for anybody in the world to read. So governments can use them, and indeed the European Commission has a small program of trying to cooperate with developing country governments to make sure that they're aware of this resource. And the OECD has similar things. And so there are places where information can be got on some chemicals, obviously not as comprehensive as everything we would like. But for us in GAHP, at least, it's the big volume killers that we would like to tackle first, things like lead.
Can I ask another question, if allowed?
Yeah, I think we have time for just one last question, or we could have a follow-up from yourself. I don't see any other questions in the audience, so perhaps Ramsa, you can ask your last question and we'll answer it and close the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Like I am very curious about the nexus between chemicals and then climate change. The reason I ask, our country is not big contributor to GHS, but having impacted a lot from the climate change. And other hand, we have a lot of chemicals are being used in different sectors. And there has been already established fact that there is a close nexus between chemical and climate change. So how this science policy panel have think of, or maybe going to address that kind of nexus between chemical and climate change?
There is, thank you, Ramsa, there is in the resolution a paragraph about recognizing the need to work out the interactions between the different panels. I have attended webinars on on those interactions, where Sir Bob Watson, who has been the chair of both the IPCC and IPBES, or has been very involved in developing them, I think he's chaired them, has talked about how difficult it can be to make a formal linkage, but how informal linkage is, and working together has been really quite productive. And I'm sure this is something that those who become involved in this panel will need to work on all the time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jill. Thanks to everyone who's asked questions. I would just like to ask if there's anyone here who has one last question or would like to share any of the things that they're concerned about or anticipate talking about. You are welcome to share those with us now. Alternatively, of course, we can talk separately or have communications outside of the webinar. So please don't hesitate to be in touch with us at GAHP. I don't see any further hands up or questions coming in. Thank you all for your kind attention today. We look forward to hearing more from you. We look forward to the discussions. Those of you who are traveling, have safe travels there. Oh, I do see one last hand. Joseph, please. You have the floor, Joseph. Please go ahead. Joseph, are you there to speak? You may unmute.
Hello,
Hello.
do you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Thank you very much for organizing this important webinar. I think that the exchange is very, very constructive. I would like to know about the scope, they invite also to consider integrative approach. Okay, taking in account the scope relating chemical, the scope relating waste, and the scope relating to pollution. We know that for example, chemicals, waste, and the pollution, each of them is a larger domain. How to reach this? Pollution, well, yeah, okay.
Certainly, there are huge issues to be discussed in each of the three areas, Joseph, and it's lovely to be talking to you. But the concept that the Secretariat is having is that you start somewhere in the circle that links pollution, chemicals, waste management, and GAHP would argue that the circle is wider than that. There are things like air pollution to be considered, and how much that needs to be brought in and how much the science of that is effectively covered elsewhere. It's not our impression that it is in terms of influencing governments, particularly for some regions of the world. So it's a question of finding the right entry point. Not everything you're doing will address all of chemicals, waste, and pollution, but it's knowing that you're not working in silos. It's not, I'm a chemist, I'm only interested in the production and the actual substance. I don't care where it goes as a waste. That is what we're trying to avoid. And I think that is, it's not an easy task, but that has to be the way to make it effective.
Thanks very much, Jill. Thank you to the participants. Again, if you are traveling to Bangkok, safe travels. We do encourage you to reach out to the GAHP team who will be there in person. Please come introduce yourself. Happy to discuss any of the points. And of course, meanwhile, happy to be in touch with you on the science policy panel moving forward. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone. I wish you a good day, good evening, or good rest of the week as well.